Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be discussing transformation of religion worldwide. Joining us on the show is a doctor in Islamic and Christian theology, Dr. ChrisHewer. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Always a pleasure.
Can you please tell us about religions and the importance of religions?
Religions really are about a way of life. And human society around the world is diverse. We are people of different cultures, different climates, different ways of eating and living and feeding and working and so on. So religions must be about helping human beings to flourish, to grow to their true potential as human beings in different cultures around the world. Now, the reality is that the way that one lives one's religious life in an African village or in the middle of New York or as an Eskimo or wherever will be quite different. But there are common elements there which are the same because human beings are the same. So within religion we see commonalities that are there for all humankind. We call this the essence of religion. And we see diversities that are specific to certain elements, certain places around the world, certain contexts, certain cultures, and these are the specifics of religion.
Do you think it's right though for a religion to kind of like change according to the culture you're in and the country you're in?
I think that we have to change according to the specifics, but not according to the essence. For example, there is no such thing as Islamic dress. This is nonsense. What there is are Islamic principles about dress, about respecting oneself, about respecting other people, about modesty and so on. Now these change from one culture to another. If you are a Muslim Eskimo, you will dress very differently to a Muslim from sub-Saharan Africa. Otherwise one would freeze and the other would roast to death. So of course there has to be change. There has to be change in terms of time and culture. So for example, we know that if it is fasting during Ramadan and you're travelling, then you don't fast. Well, what constitutes travelling? Well, travelling is a very different thing if you are going by foot across the Sahara than if you're getting on an aeroplane and going to Paris. Because you can do one without it in any way injuring your health, whereas if you were stupid enough not to drink and eat when you were walking across the Sahara, you'd be dead. So of course things have to change always. But what changes are the specific applications, not the fundamental essence of the teaching. Now, how do you know the difference? And that's where our difficulty comes in, because that requires intelligence, it requires serious knowledge and study, it requires wisdom, standing before God and seeking God's guidance, and it requires talking with other people. You know, let us not be so arrogant as to think that I may be the greatest living scholar, but I'm the only one who understands this question. No matter how great our scholarship is, we always have things to learn from other scholars' contributions. So this is how I would see change and development within religious practices within society.
But don't you think that sometimes the amount of change that would actually happen, the actual essence is then forgotten?
That is the great danger, because what you do then is that you make a secondary, tangential, subordinate thing the most important thing in the world. For example, we see young men and women, let's say young Muslim men and women going around London, Muslim women wearing a headscarf, but everything from the neck downwards says nothing about modesty. In other words, the message, the essence of the message is not entered into their whole being, their character before God. just put a headscarf on and they think that's modesty. The same with Muslim men growing a beard, and that's going to make me a good Muslim. This is absolute nonsense. Now, in the same way, we can see that someone is exuding the inner character of a person of faith, but actually you don't see that according to labels that they carry. I think that it's really important. There was a famous Christian saint called St. Francis, who was a missionary. He was going to go off and spread the message around, and when he sent his missionaries out, he said, "Go and preach the good news of Jesus. Use words if you really have to." In other words, by the way that you live your life, by the inner character. So it's not about proclaiming oneself by dress. This is identity politics. It's not as though we're going around carrying labels, but our character, our life, our inner self should glow from us. You know that the thing about what makes a prophet is someone of such a purified and exalted spirit, such a purified and exalted being, that the beautiful names of God are actually manifested in their life. So you look at the prophet and you see the qualities, the names of God manifested in his life. He doesn't need to carry a label round his neck saying, "I'm Muhammad, I'm the prophet of God." Not at all, because there was something about him that just made people want to be in his presence. There's something about him that makes people say, "You've got a message, there's something I want to know." And so our lives should be exuding the message, the goodness of God. We should be, as it were, manifesting it in the society in which we live. And this would then be truly global religion, as it were. We would be affecting the globe in which we live, the whole of society.
Do you think religion has actually transformed throughout the globe, though?
I think it has transformed, and I think that there are all sorts of factors involving that. We are living in the 21st century through quite remarkable times. If you take an old man or woman today, of let's say 80 years of age, they have lived through the most enormous development in human life and society that there has ever been in the history of the world. You just think the coming of electricity, the coming of the motor car, the coming of the telephone, the coming of the internet, the coming of the computer, the coming of television. All these have happened in the last 80 years. They have hugely changed and transformed the global society. Now, they could change and transform it in good ways as well as in bad. They could hold up a mirror and say, "This is how life is lived in this place. Well, I think I might like to be like that." So you can have a good influence in this way, but you can also have a bad influence in which people try to corrupt society through the use of these means of communication. You're not a real human being unless you've got the latest designer watch or whatever it might be. You're not a human being unless you are able to drink and abuse alcohol or whatever it might be. So we can see the way in which globalization takes both good and bad aspects, and it can do the same in religion. See, we live in a remarkable age of global communication. Take, for example, that any Muslim woman living within her own apartment, her own home, anywhere in the world, as long as she has a computer and she has access to the internet, she has access to almost an infinite amount of wisdom and knowledge and learning that her mother, her grandmother could never have dreamt of. And even her auntie, who was a university professor, didn't have access. This has all come about in the last few years, 10, 20, 30 years, has seen enormous change in access to information, and so globalization. Now the problem is, you may have access to the information, but do you have sufficient knowledge to be able to discern good information from garbage? And that's our problem, because we say of the internet, garbage in, garbage out. Anybody can put whatever they want onto the internet. It cannot be policed. That is the simple fact. Therefore, it can be a tool of propaganda, and it is being used as a tool of propaganda. Now, one of our really serious problems is that people who do not have the necessary knowledge to know the difference between good, solid, sound scholarship and propaganda are being led astray. And so globalization in this sense works in a very negative way.
That is actually happening. Many people are being led astray, but putting that point to aside for now, when you said that in this day and age, females and males have access to everything, does that make them more responsible in the sense that they're meant to know more and have more knowledge of their faith and of what's going on around them in comparison to their fathers and their grandfathers, for example?
Oh, absolutely. Because the more you know, the more responsible you are. So somebody who has never read the Quran cannot be judged by the teaching of the Quran. But somebody who has read it has, as it were, a higher standard by which they should be judged, because you know more. Now, therefore, with more access to knowledge and information, there is more responsibility on people to put that into practice and to do good things in the world. And so we live in an age of increased responsibility. The poor peasant farmer who never went more than 3 miles to the next village was hardly responsible for world trade. But the person who now understands world trade and understands the way in which it functions, even if they live in the same village that man lived in, they now have a much bigger responsibility, because you have an expanded knowledge and understanding.
Are people actually taking responsibility, though, do you think?
I think some people are, but more people are not, because we have a perversity within human nature that makes me want to exploit good things for my own ends, so that the good things of God, my intellect, my knowledge, the society in which I live, the food that I get that makes me healthy, these are not for my benefit. These are to equip me to be the Khalifa of God upon earth, to be the instrument of God to make the world a better place, to bring in the rule of law, to make justice rule, to relieve the poverty and suffering of people. Now, it's a real difficulty, because you can be educated as a scientist, you can be knowledgeable in this field, and you can use your education and your knowledge either to relieve human suffering or to bring about weapons of mass destruction. It's the same knowledge that does it. Often, it's the same elements. The radioactive element that you use to create a nuclear bomb is the same radioactive element, in essence, which is used to cure illness through radiotherapy. So the good thing has to be used by the human being. So we have a huge responsibility to make use of this knowledge that we have.
Hopefully people would actually use the knowledge that they have. But going back to the previous question, which is many people, because they have the platform to speak either full knowledge and wisdom, or to speak, garbage and stuff that have never taken place, how can one, know the difference between them? How is a person, for example, that has never studied Islam, they want to start looking into it, and then they have one speaker, promoting injustice, and then one speaker promoting justice. And then, of course, as the media mainly speaks about injustice, they would mainly go with this one, for example.
First of all, we have to say it's not easy, because think about advertising. Why do big businesses pay their advertising consultants huge amounts of money? Because they are very skilled at deceiving people. They're very skilled at deceiving people, thinking that they have to buy that product. Now, that's what advertising is all about. It is the manipulation of people, making them think that that is the product that they have to buy, and they won't be fully human without it. Now, if it was simple, then advertising wouldn't exist. Advertising works on human nature in all sorts of ways. Now, propaganda does the same thing. And as clever as authentic teaching gets, propaganda, as it were, will mirror it so that it can lead people astray. This is the work of the shaitan, the great tempter who wants to lead people astray. And as human knowledge increases, so the shaitan is learning, I could use this in order to do that. So this is a perennial human problem. Now, how do we do it in practice? Well, we try to check out the source of the material. Is this coming from an authentic teaching authority, for example? Is this coming from a certain university, from a certain scholar? We try and cross-check it. I always say to people, don't just read one version of this, cross-check it with something else. Because then we can see that, there's a comparison going on here. But it's not easy, and people are being deceived, because that's the nature of propaganda and advertising.
Because, for example, with one of the people, you would, wearing the Islamic turban, the hamama, for example, is very easy. You just have to get a cloth and wrap it around and put it on your head. That's about it. So with that, it's quite difficult in the sense that there are some people that tend to do that without actually going and studying the Islamic studies that they're meant to study. And then you would have a group of people either praising this individual or, the opposite, saying that he hasn't done his studies, etc. So how is an individual meant to know exactly if this is the right or wrong person?
It's not easy. It's not easy. The first thing you need to know is you need to know the question. See, do not be taken in by thinking that everybody wearing an imama is a genuine scholar, or that everybody who's got a bushy beard, or that every woman who's wearing a headscarf is therefore a knowledgeable teacher. That simply is not the case. Now, just to know that is a big step in knowledge, because lots of people are taken in. I think the other thing is that you've got to look at the credentials. There's a lovely saying in India, when you're looking for a marriage partner, before you pick the apple from the tree, look at the tree that bore it. Look at where its roots go. Look at the stock that's there. So where did this person study? Don't be taken in. I want to know where you studied, with whom. I want to know what courses. I want to know something about you, your biography. And I'm not going to be taken in. So be a little bit suspicious. Be a little bit skeptical. Do not be taken in, because there are lots of people. I was teaching a course in Africa a couple of years ago, and it was in a Christian college, and these were Christian ministers in training who wanted to learn something about Islam. And I noticed that several of them had on their desks a book. So the book was called The Truth About Islam. And they were holding this up and putting it on the desk, you see, so it would catch my attention. So in the end, I asked to borrow it from them. And I said, okay, now, let us look at this book. Before we open it, who is the author? It is an Egyptian Muslim who was a professor at Al-Azhar, who leaves the faith of Islam and becomes a Christian, and then says he will tell you the truth about Islam. Let's put the shoe the other way around. The Christian professor of theology in the university in Rome stops being a Christian, becomes a Muslim, and then says, I will tell you the truth about Christianity. Would you think that would be a good person to tell you the truth? And they say, oh, no, I wouldn't believe him. Well, why do you believe this person? Secondly, this person says that he's been driven away from his homeland and he's been taken in by this Christian missionary group, and they have fed him and taken him to America and so on. Do you think he might feel that he has to give a certain party line in order to get the money from this group? Oh yeah, of course. Well, then why do you believe it? Why do you accept the content of this book? See, we don't put our brains into gear. You need to interrogate the author, who published it, who paid for it. Now, I often say, I go around talking to different groups, secular groups, Christian groups, whatever. If you told me to, I could pick up that telephone and ring a certain office in London, and I guarantee that in 1 month I could have a lorry full of books that would be delivered to your library. And they would all be paid for by certain institutions, and they would all be telling exactly the same line. They wouldn't be telling you about Islam, they'd be telling you about that particular brand of Islam. Because what you're doing is that you're using your money as propaganda. And you are forcing your idea forward. Which would you do? Would you buy this book, which is going to cost you £25, or this book, which is going to cost you £5? Especially when this says it comes from a holy city, for example. So, oh, well, it must be good. Don't be naive. Don't be gullible. Just, interrogate the books. Interrogate the internet channel. Interrogate the TV channel. I mean, we've just had this case of an American so-called expert on Islamic terrorism telling the American people on a major TV channel that Birmingham is a 100% Muslim city, that no non-Muslim would dare go there, that there are parts of London that are totally dominated under Sharia law, and there are Sharia police patrolling the streets. This is on a television channel. This is a so-called expert. Now, we know that that's complete garbage.
Of course.
But there would have been many, many people listening to that who'd have been taken in. So interrogate everything.
But then with something like that happened, that's Fox News, a news channel that is, really big in America, not as respected in the UK as it is in America, but still, many people do watch the channel. Isn't there something that they can do legally saying that what you just stated is 100% wrong? And then, make sure that he apologizes for it.
He's done that. He did that very quickly. But the damage is done, you see.
Yeah.
See, we have a lovely saying. This is the kind of way that Christian etiquette used to be taught. The mother would teach the children, would say, when you tell lies, when you say something untrue, you're like a woman going through the streets with a pillow full of feathers. And every time you pull out the feathers and you scatter them. Now, when at the end you realize, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that, can you collect all those feathers? Can you stop all the harm that your words have done? This is also politics and propaganda. I can say nothing about this man, I don't know anything about him. But there are people who will deliberately lie in order to get a reaction, and then a week or a day later or whatever, they'll say, oh no, I was mistaken. But all the harm has been done.
That's mainly to make sure the people that tend to believe anything, mainly the gullible, will just accept what these people are saying, and as they don't really know about it much, they will just keep that in mind instead of the apology itself.
Absolutely right, because you've already plugged that into your brain, you see, and removing something is much more difficult than putting it in the first place. Well, it must be true, otherwise he wouldn't have said it. Okay, well, he's taken it back, but there must have been some truth in it. So you see, this is propaganda, this is advertising, this is what people do.
But that is a big problem because, with Islam, for example, it wasn't really known worldwide. And the transformation that has taken place, like since, the millennium till now, Islam has been everywhere.
Yeah.
Like we know more and more about it. Why do you think that is? And I think it's not about Islam itself. It's about the Islamic extremists that are, mainly in the media, not the genuine Muslims that you would find on any London street, really.
I think that is the real problem, because we often say, if a dog bites a human being, it doesn't get in the newspaper. If the human being bites the dog, everybody wants to know. So if you get an extreme act, it gets blasted across all the newspapers. If people do good things, nobody wants to know. And that's the reality of the world that we live in. Now, that's what's happened to Islam over the last 15 years, since 2000.
Before we look at Islam, just the point of the news, the fact that they're mainly focusing on negative, doesn't that make the human to be less faithful, in the sense that they're just reading negative news? They're nothing positive is coming their way. So they're surrounded with this negative aspect that their faith doesn't become as strong as it's meant to be if they're reading all this positiveness.
Yes, because news is about stuff that's gone wrong. If you listen to any news broadcast, it's all about, these are the terrible things that have happened today or this week. They never tell you, these are the wonderful things that have happened today. It's all about, somebody's been killed, there's been a fire, there's been an accident, there's been a tragedy, whatever. So this is what we do with news. We make it a bulletin of horrible stuff that's gone wrong. Now that, of course, then fills people's thinking. If you have enough knowledge to say, well, that's only 1% of the story, and 99%, so for every idiot who's doing an outrageous act, there are hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are doing wonderful things and living normal lives. But you never hear about those. You hear about the one idiot. Now, just to know that, just to allow that to filter in, that makes you a bit more wary. It makes you think, wait a minute, I'm not sure I believe this. And I get people who come to courses and they say, it cannot be as bad as the media tell me. Tell me something true about Islam. Really important.
But then even though news is to tell you about tragic events, etc., but then to have something at least positive, and mainly in the newspaper, isn't that a better thing? Like, not just for the publishers themselves, because there are many positive things taking place around the world, but for the reader, the fact that, they're just bombarded with all these tragic events and killings, etc. I feel it makes the individual less humane in a way. They're just used to all of these people being killed, for example, where it just becomes normal for them if they see a few people dead on the street. And that, I find, a big problem.
I think it diminishes our humanity, and it diminishes our respect for the humanity of other people. One of the terrible things that's happened in the 20th century, we began the 20th century in the West. The conduct of war was about men in uniform who were looking at each other and then shooting at each other. Now, you are very much aware of the humanity of the other person. You can see, you can almost feel their breath. You can see what they look like. We've moved during the 20th century so that the conduct of war now has been industrialized. It's been industrialized that you now have no contact with the people that you're attacking, because you fire missiles and rockets and bombs and weapons of mass destruction and so on. So you just are totally divorced from the human act of killing another person. So this reduces it almost to being like just something you see on the computer screen.
Like a video game, basically.
Like a video game, you can say. Because and you expect that if you press the button, you start the game again. But actually, these are human beings that you've killed. Now, what could be more profound as a human act than to take the life of another human being? If you remove that magnitude, that seriousness, you're in real danger. It also means that instead of it being men in uniform, 90-some-odd% of the casualties of war today are women and children, civilians, overwhelmingly women and children. Because if you're bombing cities and you're bombing villages and such like, you're going to be killing the women and children. So in our Islamic and our Christian theories of the conduct of war, our ethical principles have always told us differentiate between combatants and non-combatants. Non-combatants must not be killed, must not be threatened, must not be intimidated. Well, that's completely gone out of the window now. Because, we have the war of the cities. We're going to terrorize these people. Now, that's just another chapter in the book of we're going to set off a bomb in the middle of a big city and terrorize those people. So we have a disregard for human life that's going on here, which is terribly serious.
We do, and this is where the whole aspect of the extreme Islamists are kind of like doing, because, for example, in Iraq and in Syria, you have them killing apparently in the name of Islam, which is being spread worldwide, but the fact that they're actually killing Muslims themselves, and they're killing, the Yazidis and the Christians, and I think also the really small amount of Jewish people that are there. And that's just a really big problem, because Islam is being spread globally in the wrong way. And the fact that you do, courses of understanding Islam is, thank you very much for it. But the problem is, because there is not much of you, how are people going to understand the true message of Islam?
The only thing you can do is to try to multiply yourself. And so programs like this, thank you very much for inviting me, because it means that I can reach a wider audience than I can reach physically. So we have to learn to use the media, television, internet, and so on, as it were, to put a counterweight to the kind of stuff that's going out there all the time. And it is the fact, we have to acknowledge the fact, outrageous, wicked things are being done in the name of Islam in the world today, and in the name of Christianity in the world today, and in the name of Judaism in the world today, and. That is a reality. We are wiping out human beings like they were cockroaches. Now, that is a huge human depravity that we've got to. That's what we saw in the Holocaust, for goodness sake. You are wiping out human beings by driving them into gas chambers to kill them. That was an outrageous act of the degradation of the humanity of both, the one who did it and the one who suffered. The same is happening today in different ways. That's why we really have a struggle for the soul of humanity, that we should return to our full human dignity. And that means, fundamentally, respecting the dignity of every other human being.
But then the problem is, even though we are meant to do that, but we're not encouraged to. We're encouraged to do the complete opposite, which is, if, hundreds of people were to die in Iraq, that's fine, because, their Iraqi lives, Iraqis are not important. Whereas if 12 were to die in France, no, that's a big thing, because they're French civilians, and, the French are more important, and they're in the EU, so that makes them even more and more important. So that whole thing makes us, it becomes more of a norm for these things to happen. If there are bad situations, we're like, oh, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And that makes our faith less of, we're not as connected with God as we're meant to be, which is a really big problem.
Absolutely right. And it's not just in questions of warfare and of fighting and such like, but if you take the fight against illness, everybody, the scientists knew about Ebola in 1976. They knew all about this. Why was no medication developed? Because poor Africans can't afford to pay for it. If Ebola had struck in the rich West, then you may be sure that the drug companies would have developed medicines to counter it because they could sell them because there's a market. Now, that is human depravity, because you are allowing the economics of the marketplace to create your morality. That's where we're going wrong, that kind of thing. You're more important because you've got more purchasing power than this person. This is fundamentally immoral.
How come, do you think, with the point of Ebola, how come they're focusing on it more now, even though it's still taking place in Africa?
Well, because I think that it's hit the headlines a bit more. We've had a few Americans and Europeans who've been afflicted, and they, of course, have flown out immediately, and then they're given, it's not just the medication they're given. I mean, even the doctors themselves will say they don't know if the medication is working. What they have is extremely effective no-touch nursing, and they're looked after in isolation and so many things. Well, is it any wonder that they have a better chance of survival than if they're stuck in a field hospital in Sierra Leone or somewhere? So we don't value all human life equally. This is one of our fundamental problems.
That is a big problem, because just, you're saying that the fact that a few Americans and Europeans went, and that's when it started getting the headlines, that's just really sad, because many people are actually suffering, and the different, cares in hospitals, you can't even compare them. Like in the African countries, like we saw in the media, there were so many people that are diagnosed with Ebola, but they're all in the same place. Like, it's not as if they've been isolated, which is a really big problem. But then, how can faith, do you think, play with these things, like with Ebola and with tragic events such as wars and stuff? How can Muslims and Christians and Jews come together to make sure that stuff like this can be taken care of? At the same time, the religion isn't represented in a negative way.
First of all, the power of religion is to work on the human heart. So change the hearts of people. You change the people. They change their societies, their families. People leave one job and go and work in another. So if I was talking to a young boy or girl who was doing A-levels and thinking about a choice of career, we need to have a conversation about the morality of the kind of work you're going to take on. Are you going to take up work which ennobles and dignifies the human condition, which relieves human suffering, or are you going to go out there just to exploit? So we need that sort of discussion about changing the human soul. Secondly, we need a discussion about what our money is doing. You see, there is an important Islamic economic principle shared by Christianity too. Your money is an extension of your moral person. That means you are forbidden to drink alcohol, therefore you are forbidden to profit by alcohol sale, production, or whatever. So our money is an extension of our moral being. So I often ask people in courses, can you tell me, what is your pension fund doing today in your name? Because your pension fund is an extension of your moral being. I put money into my pension fund makes lots of money by exploiting human beings. That's immoral money. Now, of course, it won't say on the annual report exploiting human beings, but it might just say we're sourcing our goods in Bangladesh instead of paying English wages, for example. We're outsourcing to another place in the world so that we're saving money by paying exploitative wages there. So we need to be asking, how are we engaged in this, both on a local, micro level, but also on a macro level?
Thank you very much for joining us on the show, and thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.